Alright, this week on the $2 Tuesday tutorial, we're going to move into the last phase of the AOH drawing method. Well, it's not really the last phase, but it's the last of the basic phases. You don't have to watch all of these to get to get everything that's going on, but and you certainly don't have to watch them in order. But last week we did the shading of a sphere, and the week before that we did the shading of a cone, and this week we're going to do the shading of a cylinder. And I've got who speaks like that? I have a spray can here that I've wrapped in masking tape, and it gives kind of a matte surface, so once again the texture will cast a shadow on itself, but not as bad as the styrofoam does. If you remember last week, we had the ball we used on last week was a styrofoam, and you can see how the transition starts way over here where it starts to cast a shadow on itself before it gets over here. You kind of have that going on here too, but more where there's wrinkles. It's not quite as broad a transition as it is with the rough surface, but it's also not nearly as, where's my hat? It's not nearly like it would be if it were a shiny surface where the shadows are stark and straight lines. So that said, what I want you to notice about the shading of a sphere, or I'm sorry, the shading of a cylinder, is how just like on the cone and just like on the sphere, you have the bright lit side where the light is actually hitting the object. You have the shadow where the body of the object is casting shadow on itself, and then you have the backlit side of the object where the light is bouncing off of the page on the back side and illuminating the back side. So you have a bright spot, a dark spot, and another bright spot. But this side's not as bright as this side. And if you look carefully, you can almost see the shadows over here. I'm actually going to move the camera around if I can. Maybe not. Okay, I lied to you. Now the camera's going to collapse in my hands. Ah! Okay. You can barely make out the edge of the shadow down there where it's extremely dark, where the body of the object is blocking the shadow completely off the background. And then you can see there's the reflected light bouncing into the shadow, so it's not as dark here. And then here's a reflection of the shaded spot. So you have different shades of shadow as well because of the way light bounces all over the place. So this one is wicked simple. Also, because of the direction of the light is hitting here. Also, we have a little bit of shadow right here, which is what allows me to actually draw a line. And eventually we're going to talk about contour lines and how they don't really exist. So tonight, however, we're just going to concentrate on the shading of a column. So let's start with the letter H. We'll start with a column, right? That is absolutely not the straightest column I've ever drawn. Okay, so we're going to start with a column. And let's round the top of it off that way because we're not looking over the top of it. And let's round the bottom of it off because we're not down even with the bottom. And we can see that it's a rounded shape like our can. And we have our sunlight over here in the corner, over here in this direction, which means that this area over here is well lit. And it's over the top, so this area over here has a little bit of shadow. And see how we have it divided? We really just have it divided into three portions. We have the spotlight, we have the core shadow, and we have the backlit spot. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the shape of the can like it's round, because it is. It's a column. And if you'll notice, I've imagined the contour lines, because see how the top is rounded here? I've imagined the contour lines going all over the can, all the way around. And at eye level, at our eye level, which is about the middle of it, the line is straight and starts curving the other way. See? So when I shade it, I want to shade it that way so that I give the impression of the shape. If the lines actually make it to the eye, if the eye actually pick up the individual lines, I want the eye to imagine the lines as contour lines providing shape to the object. So here's our cast shadow. Here's the shadow on the body, the core shadow on the body. Here is the backlit side. And see, what I'm doing is I'm overlapping. I'm just shading it again, but I'm overlapping the first shadow with the second shadow, so that what I get is I get a secondary area that's not as bright as the brightly lit as the spotlight, but not as dark as the core shadow either. And you can reinforce that this way as well. But if you do, be sure that you get extra dark on your core shadow. Especially if your light's over here, you especially want it darker the further you get away from your light. And because our object was matte, the texture will cast a little bit of shadow on the surface as well. So you can blend that, so there's no hard edge over here. And then the shadow on the bottom, here's your widest spot, since it's actually touching the surface. Here's your widest spot, here's the back of it, and you have to imagine the other side of it coming out there and coming out and doing this. So that your shadow does this. And the absolute darkest part of your shadow is where the object blocks the light completely. Reflection of the core shadow, reflection of the backlight area. The backlight area goes around the whole back. If you were looking at it from the top, if you were looking at that from the top, remember our column is round. If you were looking at it from the top, you would have your core shadow here, and you have your core shadow here, and you would have your backlit shadow here, right? If you were to bisect it, if the colors went all the way through and you were to bisect it, it would look like that from the top. So just like a sphere. So your shadow here, your backlit area is reflected over here. Your backlit area is reflected on the back, and then your core shadow comes out from your core shadow because it's also reflected in the surface shadow. Does that make sense? You guys, am I expressing that in a manner that makes sense? Because the light is bouncing, the light is coming from your source, it's hitting your object, it's curving around your object, and it's hitting your surface, and it's bouncing back up on your object. That's why you have a backlit area. Just like when I showed you on my hand, you can see the back of my hand because the light is bouncing off of back over here and reflecting up on here. So just like on this column, the light bends and hits the paper and bounces back up to this side and illuminates this side. So just like that here, well, the same thing happens in the shadow on the paper. The darkest part is right there where the surface is touched by the object, and then where your core shadows would be, where your object is casting a shadow on itself, is reflected in the shadow. So that's what you're trying to capture down here. And then you want to blend it. You want to do your very best to blend it, because that's what your eye expects to see. Is the darkest shadow blending out to the edges. That's what your eye expects to see, is the darkest shadow blending out into the edges. And so it's part draw what you see and part draw what you expect to see, so that people can interpret what you're doing. So that is this week's $2 tutorial. And it was a very simple one, because we've already done a sphere and because we've already done a cone, we simply added the column to it. And now you know how to shade the three individual objects. The next future lessons will involve combining the objects, how the shadows will contour, how the shadows of nearby objects will contour around the shape of the object that's next to it. And that will come into play when you have a round nose on a square face, and perspective, and all the other cool things that are going to how the shadows are going to affect. And that's how you get from draw a triangle, add a spine, make a tree, is you learn how these shades affect each other. So that's this week's $2 tutorial. Thank you very much.